Good day, everyone. I hope everybody is staying healthy and safe in this incredibly challenging environment. My name is Scott Paul. I'm the president of the Alliance for American Manufacturing. AAM is a partnership between the United Steelworkers Union and several leading domestic manufacturers. And I'm incredibly grateful for the support that our stakeholders give to us. For the past 13 years, we've been working together to bring issues like manufacturing policy to the forefront and to engaging our policymakers. And I will say there has never been a more critical time to find ways to create good new jobs and to bring supply chains back to our country. So with that, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this conference, Crisis Brings Consensus, prioritizing U.S. industrial policy in a COVID-19 world. And in just a few minutes, we'll have a series of one-on-one interviews with influential senators on these matters. Senator Marco Rubio of Florida, Josh Hawley of Missouri, Tammy Baldwin of Wisconsin, and Sherrod Brown of Ohio. We will also bring in private sector experts on issues like manufacturing and China. And then we'll also get to some of your questions that you've been submitting for the last couple of days, as well as online right now. We will hope to deepen our collective knowledge about the challenges and opportunities for American manufacturing in this difficult environment. We're going to ask questions like, what does it take to reshore critical supply chains? What role do the policies of China's government play in our manufacturing crisis, both in the past, now, and possibly in the future as well? And what kinds of trade, procurement, and other policy changes do we need to make to get this right? Now, just a few guidelines to make this experience both positive and interactive for you. You can join the conversation on Twitter right now at the hashtag AmericanMade. This online conference is at or close to viewing capacity, so please don't use your slot by leaving even for a short while if you plan on coming back. We expect the running time of this event to be around 1 hour and 45 minutes with no major breaks, but with a few very brief and poignant video messages from workers around America in between the interviews and the panels that we have planned for you. So grab your snack and beverage and sit back. And keep in mind, this conference is still 90 minutes shorter than the movie Pearl Harbor, and we promise you it's going to be a whole lot more memorable. So thank you all for being a part of this. And in just a few seconds, I'm going to hand the conversation over to Josh Rogin. Josh is a widely respected Washington Post columnist and CNN analyst. Josh has covered U.S.-China relations extensively, and he has the habit of breaking important news about these matters. Josh will be interviewing Senators Rubio and Hawley, and he'll be moderating our first panel conversation before he hands the program back to me for interviews with Senator Baldwin as well as Senator Brown and our concluding panel. I'm grateful for the time that Josh, the senators, and the panelists have given to this conference. So up next, we'll have Josh Rogin with Senator Marco Rubio of Florida.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you to AAM for inviting me to participate today. For those watching at home, please tweet about the event using the hashtag AmericanMade. With U.S.-China relations and the need for economic recovery front and center, this is a critical moment to debate what needs to be done regarding American manufacturing and how industrial policy can be changed to help strengthen our nation and benefit American workers. Senator Marco Rubio has been ahead of the pack in Congress in talking about the need to restore American leadership in manufacturing. And he was demanding the United States confront challenges posed by Xi Jinping's China before it was fashionable. Marco Rubio has served in the United States Senate since 2011, and among his committee assignments are Select Intelligence, Appropriations, Foreign Relations, and Chair of the Small Business Committee. Last month, Senator Rubio argued in the New York Times on the need for a new American industrial policy in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic. Senator Rubio, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Your op-ed in the New York Times calls on the United States to build resilience into our industrial policy and restore manufacturing capability in several critical sectors. Do you have a sense of whether or not there is really the political will in Washington to move in that direction? And how exactly do you see that playing out?
Well, I think a lot of that is going to depend on whether this pandemic will result in long-term thinking and strategic planning, or whether as soon as it passes, we'll kind of move on to the next thing. And that's yet to be seen. There are some events that happened to our country. 9/11 is one example in which we've seen sort of permanent changes that have forever marked the way we do business and see things. And then there are things that have happened in the past that within months and weeks, we kind of put it behind us and get the lessons from it. But many of the things that this pandemic has revealed are issues we need to be addressing anyways, because we face a critical imbalance in our relationship with China that doesn't just leave us vulnerable to military leverage and geopolitical diplomatic leverage, but economic vulnerabilities, that some of which have been exposed during this crisis.
Just to follow up on that, when you look at the coronavirus bills that were passed in the last few months and that are ready to be debated now, do you see that shift in policy? Do you see that long range over the horizon thinking? Is that packed into the trillions of dollars we're now laying out in response to this crisis?
No, and look, and to be fair, these are all emergency responses. I mean, they are the kinds of things you do in response to something that's ongoing and right in front of you. I think that some of the vulnerabilities that this pandemic have revealed are not unique to the pandemic. They're, for example, the dependence on pharmaceutical active ingredients that come from China, and the vulnerability that creates for us, beginning in the military and in the VA, is something that's existed from beforehand. So I really think that right now there is a growing energy behind the idea that we need to do something. I think, unfortunately, in politics, sometimes the default position is just to say really nasty things and come up with things that are not realistic about, let's not buy anything that is made in China and so forth and so on. I mean, that's a sentiment. But the reality is we don't need tactics. We need a strategy. And then the tactics should be tactics that put in place the strategy, not the other way around.
Well, you mentioned the politics. It seems to me that many of the aspects of your plan seem to cross over with issues that Democrats, and especially industrial state Democrats, have raised now and in the past. Nevertheless, as you point out, the China issue is becoming increasingly politicized and partisan. What do you see as the opportunities for collaboration, and what's your comment on the increasing politicization of the China issue in Congress?
Yeah, two things. I mean, any time that the policy prescriptions, and any time that the things you want done in law are the same on both sides, maybe for different reasons, that's when America can do some pretty amazing things. I think it's important to understand, though, that there may come a time when we diverge on some of those views, because our ideas are different why we're doing it. I'm doing it for purposes of national security and resiliency. There are others that might be doing these policies because they view capitalism as not the ideal model. So those are two different motivations behind it. On the issue of what the opportunities are to move forward and the politicization of it, what I mean by politicization is this issue with China. Anger is not enough. To be angry at China, to say mean things about China, we don't have any quarrel with the Chinese people. They're the number one victims in the world of the Chinese Communist Party. Our problem is the Chinese Communist Party, and through their government, is undertaking an effort to dominate the world in key sectors that are going to be critical to the 21st century, and our policies are letting them do it. They're taking advantage of what we have allowed them to do, and we've got to bring equilibrium back to that relationship. I have no problem with the Chinese people. I don't want to go to war with China, but we have to have balance in our relationship, or we're going to have a war and we're going to have conflict. So I view it almost anything else as a way to secure peace.
Excellent, thank you. President Trump has made manufacturing a key element of his presidency, and it was a key element of his campaign. But if you look at the stats, the numbers of manufacturing jobs in this country have not significantly risen since President Trump came into office. Well, why do you think that is, and what do you think will be different going forward, if anything?
Well, the process of bringing back manufacturing and having more manufacturing activity in the U.S. is not a 2 or 3 year proposition. There are no easy fixes for it. This requires businesses to make the decision that they're going to make something, that they're going to make it here in the United States, and that's the right choice for them to make. So it requires us to, number one, as a country, identify what are those industries, what are those sectors of our economy that we want to have a domestic capacity, both for national security and national interest, and also because it creates good jobs. And then once we've identified what those industries are, we have to identify what are the incentives that we can create so that the private sector will make the decision to do that. And then third is it actually has to happen, and these are capital investments. It takes time to turn those around. What I think is undeniable is that the process of divesting from China as the core of the world supply chain is ongoing even before this pandemic. And I think this only will accelerate it, not just for the US, but for countries in Europe and Asia and throughout the world.
After 3 years of challenging China's economic aggression, the Trump administration has had some successes and some shortcomings. We do have a lot of tariffs, which are controversial, but remain in place. And we also have a phase one trade deal, which some people think is more significant than other people. Is that enough? What more can the administration do to confront China's economic aggression?
Yeah, and I don't think the administration claims that that's enough. I think for them it was sort of a step in the right direction, but clearly not the way there. I don't think that many. In fact, the phase one of the deal and some of their agricultural purchases is going to tell you exactly who we're dealing with. I think for the Chinese, it was an effort to try to put this issue to bed and see what happens in the election. I think they calculate that if Joe Biden wins, that they're going to have a better go of it. I think for the president, it's an opportunity to sort of get something done with regards to China, and while we work on the bigger overall strategy that's probably going to take multiple presidencies to put in place. And on the phase one issue, I mean, some of I think the Chinese will cook the books to make the deal look like they met the quotas on the agricultural purchases. But the issue with China goes much deeper than how much we sell them and how much they sell us. It's about the things that are made in China that we depend on for our national security and our economic wherewithal. And we cannot have so much of those things that we depend on, the manufacturing of it, concentrated in a country that has a clear plan to undermine us from an industrial and economic perspective.
Excellent. Thank you. You have been out front talking about the negative role that Wall Street and financialization of the economy have played on American manufacturing. I'd like to ask you about that, but also you've also been very active on the issue of American investor dollars going into Chinese companies, including illicit Chinese companies. Where do you think we are on the role of in the project of reforming the relationship between Wall Street and manufacturing on the one hand and Wall Street and China on the other?
Well, one thing that's really interesting and during this pandemic is that there are days where Wall Street's actually done quite well in comparison to the rest of the economy. So it should open our eyes to how far apart Wall Street and the economy are. You can have a very great day on this. You can have a great day at the stock market. It absolutely reflects not whatsoever on the vast majority of the economic lives of most Americans. Number two is, if you think about capitalism, which is ultimately what the stock market is about, is the allocation of capital. Capitalism gives you the most efficient outcome. A pure free market is going to give you the most efficient outcome when you allocate capital. And frankly, the allocation of capital and manufacturing to China provides a more efficient result. That is cheaper to do it over there. You can make a bigger profit. You can sell more of the products than you could in some other country or in the United States. And I'm generally in favor of capitalism. In fact, I almost always am. Except sometimes the most efficient outcome is not in the national interest of our country. And when those moments happen, then perhaps some of these corporate leaders view their role as the most efficient outcome. But my role as a public official on behalf of the United States is the national interest. When our national interest diverges from the most efficient capitalist outcome, we have an imperative to get involved and address it. And so it may be more efficient to rely on China for the active ingredients in pharmaceuticals, for 45% of the world's protective gear and medicine. It is not in our national interest for that to be the case.
Excellent. Just this week or last week, the White House determined that money under the thrift savings plan shouldn't be used to invest in Chinese companies. You were a leader on that issue. What do you think happened there, and what does that tell us about how this administration is dealing with the issue of Wall Street and China?
Right. We filed a bill on this over close to, 6 months ago. It's bipartisan. We've been engaged with the White House, and I'm glad they took action. I still think we need to pass legislation because I don't know what a future administration will do. But that said, here's the issue. From members of Congress and to members of the military, all invest through this thrift savings plan. It's kind of a 401k equivalent for federal workers. And some of these are invested heavily in these index funds that are tied to the Chinese economy and to companies into whom we have absolutely no transparency. We don't know how bad they are, how good they are, how the money's being spent, what their true financial state is, and so forth. But at a minimum, just imagine the extraordinary leverage that it gives a country like China, which controls these firms ultimately. Whether they're independently owned is irrelevant. You don't exist if the Chinese Communist Party doesn't allow you to. Imagine the leverage it gives them if they could single-handedly tank the retirement funds of the U.S. military personnel, of members of Congress, of the federal workers and so forth. Not to mention that some of these retirement funds are being invested in companies who are a linchpin of the Chinese effort to overtake us in biotechnology and military technology and space technology and quantum computing and biomedicine. That this is it's illogical that we would take the investment dollars and retirement of Americans and use it to invest in companies whose stated purpose is to put our firms and our capability out of business.
Excellent, thank you. Senator, right now we're in the midst of an unprecedented crisis, and as you noted, we're focused on relief and immediate recovery. But over the longer run, we know there will be a new normal. We just don't know what that new normal will look like. Imagine for a moment that the industrial policy that you envision is a part of that. At that point, what defines success for the American economy, and what do U.S.-China relations look like in that scenario?
Well, I actually think in order for this to work, we're going to need an international coalition of like-minded nations. I know the word coalition sends people immediately to get defensive, but we're not alone. Look, countries in Europe and in Asia, whether they're saying it publicly the way we do or not, are all seeing firsthand. They're both uncomfortable with China's efforts to bully people into not talking about the pandemic, but they're also very uncomfortable about their own vulnerabilities. So I think it's an important opportunity for us to partner with like-minded nations all across the world and come up with a post-pandemic model for global economics, one that does not have supply chains so heavily invested in one single place. I think the second point that I would make in regards to the sort of a post-pandemic economic situation is also the fact that for many countries around the world, what I think you're going to see is they are going to begin to define certain industries, such as medicine, protective gear, things in line. They're going to begin to identify critical industries and begin to protect their own critical industries as well. So we need to be prepared for the fact that other countries other than China may begin to become more protectionist on some of these key industries. And the third thing I would keep an eye on is right now, a lot of companies are in trouble all over the world, including companies in Europe, which is a prime opportunity for Chinese investment funds to acquire them by debt, in essence, not by buy, even if they can't get in because of a CFIUS type review where government blocks foreign ownership. If you owe them money because they've lent you money that you can't pay back, they can ultimately take over these companies. And if these companies are in critical sectors, you begin to lose your national capacity. So I think that's something that bears watching.
And just finally, what do U.S.-China relations look like in a post-pandemic scenario?
I hope more balanced. Obviously, we would look. I have my views on their totalitarian regime, and we're going to continue to speak out on their human rights. Ultimately, with a country of that size and power, we are limited in what we can do to change the trajectory of their politics. Ultimately, that will be something that plays out in China. And you would hope that over time, the Chinese people would demand more freedoms and more opportunities and a country that adheres more to those principles. What we can't control is the nature of our relationship, which I believe will define the 21st century. And I want it to be a balanced relationship. At its core, a relationship where both countries have companies that are critical to our national interest. And so we take steps to protect our companies as they do theirs. But ultimately, to the extent we are interacting in trade and commerce, our companies are allowed to do over there what they are allowed to do over here. Right now, that's not the case. They can come here and do whatever they want. But our companies, on the other hand, are limited. They're not a developing nation any longer. They're the second largest economy, soon to become on a gross basis the largest economy in the world. We need to stop treating them like some poor country that needs to be allowed to cheat in order to catch up. So a balanced relationship on that front is what we need. And we'll be able to partner on some initiatives of mutual interest. But there'll also be a competitive sense to that, and that's fine. But it has to be balanced. If it becomes dangerously imbalanced, then you can have conflict, which is what none of us want to see.
Senator Rubio, thank you again for spending time with us today.
Thank you for doing this.
I think it ought to be free trade if we were all on the same level playing field. But when we're not on the same level playing field as far as environmental constraints or labor constraints, you're not getting the same product in the end. And to force us to price our product to their product when you're not comparing apples to apples is not adding up.
And we're back with Senator Josh Hawley. Thank you so much, Senator, for taking the time to speak with us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Recently, you made a speech about China policy on the Senate floor that called for a drastic rethink of the way that we deal with not only China economically, but the international economic system writ large. You said, quote, "The international order as we have known it for 30 years is breaking. Now imperialist China seeks to remake the world in its own image and to bend the global economy to its own will." You propose that we must recognize the economic system designed by Western policymakers at the end of the Cold War does not serve our purposes in the new era. Many leaders have called for a reform of these institutions. You seem to be calling for something much different. Explain what exactly you'd like to see.
Well, I think the first thing we have to realize is that economic and security policy, economic policy and security policy need to be integrated. I mean, they really can't be separated probably ever, but certainly not in this critical period. So we need to be thinking about our security policy in terms of the global economic system and vice versa. And the second thing I would say is, I think it's important to see that the post-World War II economic order, typified by the Bretton Woods and GATT, is in many ways qualitatively different than the post-Cold War economic and strategic order, which in many ways is typified by the WTO, although there's a whole series of institutions, of course, that make up, and agreements that make up the post-Cold War order. And my argument is that the post-Cold War order has run its course, that it was not designed to account for the rise of an imperialist China that's seeking hegemony in the Indo-Pacific and beyond, that order, that post-Cold War economic order, has also damaged American industry, the American economy in many ways that are quite significant for us domestically. And for those reasons together, we need to consider very serious reform. We've got to your point, it's not just enough, I think, to tinker around the edges. We have to realize that we're in a qualitatively different world now and a different international system than we were in 1990 or 1995, and we need to act accordingly.
Well, Senator, let me press you on that point. You've suggested such steps as abolishing the World Trade Organization. Most people advocate for reforming these international organizations or even bolstering them and then coercing or enticing China to cooperate and act better. The criticism would be that if you get rid of all these institutions, or at least stop U.S. involvement on them, the rest of the world will go on without us and we'll be isolated, and China will take advantage of and leave those institutions against us. How do you prevent against that, and why not fix them rather than nix them?
Well, I think that the argument that we'll liberalize China by including it and that we should try and entice a change in Chinese behavior, that's how Chinese membership, for instance, of the WTO was sold to us in 2000, 2001. That's how the permanent most favored nation status was sold to us. And that gamble, which may have been worth taking at the time, but we need to admit that it just hasn't paid off. In retrospect, it turns out to have been a mistake. It has not panned out. China has not become more liberal. If anything, under President Xi, China has become even more of a authoritarian, totalitarian state. Just look what they're doing in Hong Kong. So I think that gamble on liberalization has not panned out, A. B, I would say that the United States, we're the ones who were the significant leaders, in partnership with our allies, of course, but we were the prime movers both in the post-World War II system, the Bretton Woods, GATT system, et cetera, IMF, World Bank. We were also the prime movers in the 1990s in creating a more globalized, deeply integrated system, and the WTO, again, sort of typifies that. So I'm not advocating withdrawal from the world. I'm not advocating that the United States draw up the drawbridge and to not trade. We are a trading nation, and we are going to be. We have to be. That's how we sustain our vibrant middle class. We've got to shape new institutions that will actually allow us to get agreements, build partnerships that are good for us. By the way, Josh, that doesn't mean we get rid of every global institution we know of. I've focused on the WTO as one that I think has proved to be pretty resistant to reform, as we saw with the failed round of the Doha talks. The WTO, the way it is set up, it proves to be pretty difficult to reform, and it's basically not working at all now anyway. The dispute resolution procedure is just on ice, and it's a mess, by the way. The dispute resolution is a total mess. Because of the need for unanimity for any significant change, you can't get major changes pushed through. So it's really, that is a good example, I think, of where we would do better to say to our allies and partner nations, let's just scrap this and let's do something different that is better for us together.
Thank you. One of the things you've written about often is the need to rebuild American manufacturing and protect American workers. While there's a growing group of lawmakers in both parties calling for this, it does seem out of step with traditional Republican free market emphasis and emphasis on big business opportunity. How do you reconcile that? How do you return manufacturing and increase protectionism at the same time staying true to America's traditional role as a free trading nation?
Oh, well, I mean, I don't know. I think it's actually quite Lincolnian, the founder of my party, in the sense that, Lincoln was worried about Americans as producers, as workers. He saw as the ideal an individual who would be able to support himself or herself by the work of their own hands. He wanted to get an economy where that would be possible. I think that remains our goal. It should be. There's nothing I think that is more American, A, and frankly, Republican should be, B, than fighting for an economy where where workers can support themselves and their families. So we need to get a global trade order and an international security system that permits that and facilitates that and allows that. And I think that's really consistent with the Republican Party's history and with our best ideals. I am not for withdrawal or isolate. This is not even possible. Take my own state of Missouri. We have farming as our number one industry. We've got products we need to sell. We need to trade. We've got a lot of manufacturing. We need to sell and trade that. We want to do it. But we need to pursue policies, trade policies, and other broader economic policies internationally that will actually foster industry in our country, will protect vital jobs, and that recognize that, this economic equation that sounds great in a textbook that says, well, aggregate returns go up, but you may lose millions of jobs in the process. But in the aggregate, it's good. Well, aggregate for whom? It's not great if all of the returns are captured by a very small class of people on, say, Wall Street, or by a small class of professionals. We want to see an economy where there are jobs available for everybody who can work, and where you can support yourself and your family by work. So again, I think that's a pretty traditional Republican theme, and I think we're trying to figure out what that looks like in this century.
Excellent. Thank you. Speaking of what that looks like, we're now in the process of spending trillions of dollars to respond to the coronavirus pandemic that's plaguing the world. And do you think that some of that money should go to this very effort to rebuild American manufacturing and protecting American workers? And can you give us some specifics of what you would like to see in the next, however, $1 trillion recovery bill to address this issue that you're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes and yes. The first part is, do we need to see efforts made to bring production back to this country, to reshore our critical supply chains? Absolutely we do. And how might we do that? I think we can pursue a number of options. Number one, when it comes to our critical medical supply chains, for instance, and the manufacturing that goes with those, we probably ought to enact new local content requirements and just say, listen, X percentage of the inputs have to be produced here, manufactured here in the United States. Second way we can do that is with tax incentives. A third way we can do it is with financing. And this is something that we see Japan right now experimenting with, or low interest financing for companies that reshore, move jobs back. And again, tax incentives to do that. So I think that we have a panoply of policy tools available to us. We just got to be willing to use them. And I just want to emphasize that the best way to make the American economy strong is to make the American worker strong. And to do that, we've got to address some of these structural issues that we're seeing where we've lost too much manufacturing of all kinds, including advanced high-tech manufacturing. Can I just say, Josh, as a side on this, a lot of times when you talk about manufacturing leaving the country, people say, oh, heavens, manufacturing isn't the future. I dispute that. Manufacturing, first of all, is vitally important in my state, but manufacturing is absolute. It's got to be the part of the future of this country. High-tech manufacturing, precision tooling, you name it. Medical device manufacturing. We've got to have all of the above and more in this country, and we've got to take concrete steps to get it here.
What do you think are the odds that some of these items will actually be in the next recovery bill?
I think actually pretty decent, in the sense that the coronavirus pandemic and the crisis it has caused has really opened people's eyes to our dependence from a production manufacturing perspective on China and on other foreign nations. And so I think that there is, let me just put it to you this way. I haven't been in the Senate very long. I've only been here a year and I guess 4 months, but I've heard more talk in the last 4 weeks about the need to bring back production in this country than I have in the last year and 4 months put together. So that I think is a very positive sign. I think there could be a bipartisan consensus here. And I also think we need to take steps, by the way, when it comes to the short term in this country, we need to take steps to focus on employment getting unemployment down, helping businesses rehire workers, and I proposed a plan to do that too. But again, bringing back supply chains, bringing back production of all kinds to this country, I think is just vital to our long-term health.
Thank you so much. Finally, Senator, I'd like you to comment on the Trump administration's Phase 1 trade deal with China. The ink was barely dry when the pandemic hit, and most were skeptical that China would honor it before the pandemic, and much more skeptical now that the pandemic will hit that this trade deal will be honored by the Chinese side. What's your view on that? What should we double down on this Phase 1 trade deal and try to enforce it? Should we move past it and try to go our own way? And or should we try to do something in addition to that? And if so, what should be in that future trade agreement?
Well, we should for sure try to enforce it. I mean, we've negotiated it. They have agreed to it. I hear from the White House that they are already trying to renegotiate critical portions of it, to which we've got to just say, absolutely not. I mean, we have an agreement here. And by the way, one of the interesting things about this agreement is that it contains internal enforcement mechanisms. It has dispute resolution procedures built into the agreement, which is interesting. This is a different approach, for instance, than the relying on the WTO dispute resolution body and the appellate body. So that is potentially a model that we can use. We have used in the past, and we could use going forward with other agreements with other nations, including multilaterally. But just on Phase 1, I think we've absolutely got to try to hold them to their word. Do I think that they will act in good faith and live up to it? No. But that's no reason not to try and enforce it, Josh, and to show the world, by the way, that it is, once again, it is China, it is the Communist Chinese Party that is the bad actor here, and that what they do to us in terms of reneging on their trade deals, trying to change the terms, they do to everybody. I mean, this is their action across the board, and it will help us, I think, build coalitions of partners and allies who say, we got to do something different as it relates to China, as it relates to global trade. Let's do it together.
Senator Hawley, thank you so much for your time today, and thank you for your service.
Thank you.
As a first-generation steelworker, out of a family of 8, it allowed me I got a job at U.S. Steel. It got us off of food stamps or public assistance, and allowed me to purchase a home for my mother and my 7 other siblings.
All we're asking for as steelworkers is a fair chance. I walk in that plant, I don $500 worth of safety equipment. My foreign competitors are operating with sandals and shorts on.
Welcome back. As the COVID-19 public health emergency moves to the next phase, Americans will be looking to their elected officials to restart a stalled economy, reemploy millions, and repair broken supply chains. How will legislators prioritize these issues in the Great Rebuilding? In this event, we'll hear from 2 experts. Emily de la Bruyere is a co-founder of Horizon Advisory and a noted expert on China's civil-military fusion. She has testified before Congress and written extensively on China's response to the coronavirus. Drew Greenblatt is CEO of Marlin Steel Wire, a small but mighty manufacturer in Baltimore. Drew is a national leader and has been outspoken and mostly correct about the value of manufacturing and the challenges that China's policies face for businesses like his own. Let's start with you, Drew. Can you just tell us, before the pandemic, before the coronavirus, how did Chinese government manufacturing and industrial policies affect your business? What were the challenges? What were the costs, and how were you dealing with it before the pandemic broke out?
Chinese manufacturing has been playing havoc with American manufacturing for decades. Marlin Steel has been a victim of dumping, of intellectual property theft. We've been treated horribly, like so many American manufacturers. Many manufacturers went under. Chinese companies bring products into America cheaper than the price of steel. They don't follow environmental standards that we find so critically important. They don't treat their workers well. It's a very unfair situation. Their currency is debauched so that they could sell more into America. The American system needs a massive reset so that we could be fair to the American worker. Marlin Steel in particular has had all kinds of our products stolen by Chinese companies, and we've been victims of dumping for decades. It's horrific.
Let me just ask you a quick follow-up question. When the Trump administration imposed steel and aluminum tariffs, they said that this was to correct the imbalance and to exert punishment on Chinese bad practices. Did that help? What were the impacts of the tariffs over the 2 years between when they were implemented and when the trade deal was finalized?
Marlin Steel buys all of our steel from Illinois and Indiana steel mills. So we were not impacted by the tariffs. Our competition, which imports Chinese steel, was impacted by tariffs because their costs went up. The bottom line is that it's beyond steel tariffs. We need just a total reset. We cannot trust China as a supply chain partner. They cheat on trade deals. They cheat and steal our intellectual property. They hack our COVID research teams. This is not a partner for a long-term relationship. We need a reset in how we look at China.
Thank you, Emily. Let me turn to you. Help us understand what we know about Beijing's strategy, about their intentions. Again, before the pandemic, for right now, what were they trying to do? How are they trying to do it? And how does that fit into their larger strategy?
Yeah, actually, we know a lot. We know that Drew's story is not an accident and that China does this across the board. It does it all along supply chains and across industries. Beijing uses industrial planning to achieve geopolitical ends. Beijing's industrial planning, we know, follows a two-step process. First, China uses market control, uses state subsidies, uses stolen intellectual property to hollow out strategic industries, to make sure that foundational elements of the global system depend on China. It does this in steel. It also does this in pharmaceutical supply chains. Next, in the second step, China uses that leverage to set the standards for those industries, to write their rules so it can control and it can govern them, so that it can own their innovation and also in them give its state champions enduring inherent competitive advantages. Beijing does this in 5G. It also does it in new energy vehicles, in autonomous vehicles, in new materials, in advanced manufacturing. And we know that Beijing's industrial offensive is deliberate. This goes back decades, and the industrial priorities are relatively consistent throughout. We also know that thanks to China's military-civil fusion strategy, every industrial advance is translated to economic and to security coercion.
Thank you. Let me ask you the same question I asked Drew. Emily, when the Trump administration imposed the steel and aluminum tariffs, they said this was meant to pressure Beijing to come to the negotiating table, as well as to correct some of the imbalances. What did you see from your research? What was the effect of these tariffs on our industry before the trade deal was signed?
Yeah, this is the first time that we've actually had a strong narrative about Beijing and about its unfair practices. And China noticed that. China noticed that we're finally, for the first time, after decades of them doing this, starting to take the matter seriously. But Beijing is also adept at maneuvering around tariffs, at finding loopholes, at moving its manufacturing, at operating through subverted elements of the global system. So these tariffs were an amazing narrative measure in terms of telling them that we're doubling down and we're trying to compete. But that's most of what they are, and it's really just the beginning of a strategic response.
True.
Let me turn back to you, Drew. In January of this year, the Trump administration and the Chinese government signed a phase one trade deal, removing some but not all of the tariffs, declaring victory. What have you seen? Has that changed the game? Has the deal worked so far from where you sit, and what more needs to be done?
So much more needs to be done. We are in a long game. We have to think in generation mindset. It's unacceptable how they've treated us in the past, and we've been pansies basically, and we've been walked all over, and it's wildly unacceptable. And the American workers is getting trashed. It's hollowing out our country. The critical issue here is phase one was productive, but not enough. We have to do much, much more. We have to get much more aggressive and take this threat in the context of they're trying to eat our lunch. and we're going to be poorer for it. And the way America differentiates ourselves from other countries is by having tremendous innovations. Our company's developed 7 different patents, and we have 20% of our employees are degreed engineers coming up with these really innovative, novel products. That's how we differentiate ourselves from other companies and other countries. But they just go steal it. They copy and paste it and sell it into America. But we're typical. I mean, this is a common practice. This is what they do. So we have to stop that. We have to nip this in the bud. Phase 1 was good, but not enough. We have to go much farther and aggressively address these topics. Otherwise, the middle class of America is going to be hurt. American manufacturing is going to be stifled for generations if we continue this policy.
Emily, a similar question. What do you think of the Phase 1 trade deal and its ability to get at some of these structural issues and some of these industrial policies that the Chinese government has been perpetrating for all these years? We know what it says about buying American beef and agricultural goods. What about the intellectual property and part? Do you think it has a chance of making any difference?
I'm going to agree with Drew on all fronts. This isn't like China did something bad and now we're reconciling that and coming to an agreement. China has a long-standing strategy that's premised on stealing our intellectual property and that seeks to subvert our system. So one deal isn't going to change that. China's going to sign this deal so that the whole thing gets pushed down the road, so that we use all of our resources, our diplomatic resources, our government resources to sign a deal. And then Beijing has that much more runway to continue deploying the industrial offensive it's been at since the 1970s.
Okay, well, if you both agree that that's the case, then I must ask you, what are the future steps that this administration or maybe the next administration should take? What are the policy options for addressing this in a more systemic, more long-lasting way? Drew, let me start with you.
Well, for starters, if a company steals property, they shouldn't be allowed to export to America anymore. Their products should not come to America, period. End of conversation. And, Emily very shrewdly brought up the issue of loopholes. I mean, then what they'll do is they'll put a company in Vietnam or Indonesia that's fake and bank it through Vietnam or India or whatever and into America to get around American laws. The bottom line is we have to be nimble enough and adaptable enough to address the people skirting the plan. But the bottom line is if you cheat, you're not allowed to sell into the biggest economy in the world, period. End of conversation. And we should have agreements with Canada and Mexico and England, et cetera, so that we all are adhering to this. And that'll teach companies that you can't steal things and you can't dump steel. And, if you make rules and create moats with our fellow nations, again, Japan, Canada, England, so they can't sell to any of us, I think then you'll have some teeth. And that's what I think we should be pursuing, but a very aggressive approach on that and just forbidding certain companies from coming into America. And then the message will start resonating. By the way, what we're doing with Huawei is tremendous. I mean, we're cutting off their chip supply. They have nefarious designs on our intellectual property. So that's another example of being proactive and doing it effectively.
Emily, before you answer, let me mention to our audience here that Horizon Advisory had a great report recently featured in the Washington Post talking about how the Chinese government is seeking to take advantage of the coronavirus pandemic to advance its industrial and strategic expansion. So in light of that, tell us a little bit about that. And also then, if that is the case, that Beijing has a strategy to profit from the crisis that we're all in, what strategy could we have to prevent that?
Thanks, Josh. And that's exactly where I was going to start. So thank you. We're reading Beijing treat COVID-19 explicitly as a window of opportunity. China sees this as something akin to the 2008 financial crisis as a chance for them to leap ahead, except this chance is bigger. Beijing sees that markets are desperate for liquidity, that market share is up for grabs, that strategic assets are depreciating, and that concerns about security have been pushed by the wayside. This is China's dream. Plus, you add in the fact that COVID came from China So they're poised to recover first, so they have a first mover advantage. And China's moving in at pace to take advantage of this. It's deploying its capital, its information systems, and its industry. And here's the twist. China does this fueled by foreign resources. It's fueled by foreign capital that it attracts by labeling China as the safe haven at a time of global turbulence. And China also leverages foreign governments' investments that are meant for their own economies. When Washington passes a massive infrastructure package to respond to COVID, China is going to do everything it can to make sure that its companies are the ones that get that money, and that they get the footholds in US infrastructure and industry that come of that. So that's a problem. And we need a strategic response. We needed one yesterday. We need one even more now with COVID. And maybe at the very least, this crisis is what wakes us up. So what's the strategic response? First, we need to learn to play offense. And we play offense in a way that's actually tailored for the nature of the modern competition. So we fight for the industrial capacity, the networks, the systems, the platforms that China's trying to subvert. And we fight in the process, we buy American, we work with our allies, we work with our partners to make sure that our good intentions don't just keep doing what they're doing, which is fueling Beijing's offensive. Second, we play defense. We realize that China weaponizes capital and it weaponizes integration, and that's not going to change. So we stop making unforced errors. We stop giving them our IP, we stop giving them our innovation, and we actually work to take them out of the strategic nodes and industries and actors that they've co-opted. Obviously, we can't do this indiscriminately across the board. We have to recognize that reality, and we also can't just respond whack-a-mole when a Chinese company comes up and gets onto our radar. So that means that we need to craft and we need to deploy a prioritization logic. And finally, we need to change the narrative. China's out there trying to subvert the global system. And at the same time, Beijing's propaganda machine is such that it's able to label itself as the good actor. So China's trying to take our jobs and it's to take our freedoms, and it's doing this across the world. China's deploying an information-enabled stranglehold over our economy and our lives. And it's doing so based on our resources. That's not good for anybody. It's not good, certainly not good for US factories. It's not even good for the US hedge funds that China has in its pocket. So we start actually saying that. And Washington starts shaping immediate incentives so that they align with America's longer-term interests.
Well, thank you both. You've eloquently and laid out the scope and scale of the huge challenge that we all face. Now it's up to all of us in Congress, government, business, the media, and society to mount a whole of government, a whole of nation response to this generational challenge that we all face. Thank you both so much for participating today. Thank you all in the audience for viewing. This concludes this part of the event.
A big thank you to Josh Rogin, as well as to our panelists, Emily and Drew, for your insights on US-China relations and the impact it has on American manufacturing. Coming up right after this brief video is my interview with US Senator Tammy Baldwin of Wisconsin.
When people have very good, well-paying jobs, it helps the community from the top down. You know, economically, it supports the whole community, all the stores and restaurants and stuff of that sort.
Senator Baldwin, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Great. So let's get right to it. You are the major co-author of a big piece of legislation that I think virtually every Senate Democrat has supported with respect to the Defense Production Act and the response to this coronavirus crisis. And clearly, there have been missteps that this administration has made along the way in the application of the Defense Production Act. But I think that, I mean, you're from a manufacturing state. You probably know this pretty well. Is one of the concerns also that you think we've lost some of the domestic capacity to make some of these critical medicines and materials, and we urgently need to find a way to redress that?
There's no question that both of the issues you raise have gotten us into the troublesome position that we're in right now. Whether it's the failure of the administration to unlock the full potential of the Defense Production Act, or whether it's the fact that in a pandemic, you have this coronavirus hitting different countries at different times, and so you can assume that local production of needed items are going to be seized for that country's or that area's use. All of those things have put us in a really difficult position at the beginning, and it's continuing. And I think until we unlock the full potential of the Domestic Production Act or Defense Production Act, we are going to be lagging behind. So in this particular case, I have introduced the Medical Supply Transparency and Delivery Act. And what this would do is take it from a needs assessment, a supply assessment, locate what's in the gap, and then see what domestic manufacturing capabilities we have to turn quickly to filling that gap. And then it's meant to be very transparent so that people can see that this is being updated regularly as new needs like PPE and testing and other medical equipment come on board, and then has to have a very transparent supply chain logistics to get it to where it's needed. And at the same time, for future pandemics or another wave of the COVID-19 that could recur in the summer, fall, or winter, we need to be restocking our national strategic stockpile to be prepared so that we don't have the situation we did this time.
Indeed. I wanted to shift a second to another piece of legislation that you've just recently introduced, and thank you for that. It deals with consumer labeling, together with Senator Scott from Florida. And I know when I've been in Wisconsin, in Racine or Kenosha or Wausau or Green Bay, one of the frustrations is like, well, I can't find anything made in America, or it's hard to even know where the product was produced. So clearly there is a desire for Americans and for consumers to have this information. Why has it been so difficult, and what would your legislation do to address this?
So this legislation is called the Cool Online Act, and COOL standing for Country of Origin Labeling. So our nation's labeling laws predate online retailing and online shopping. And so you usually can find out, if you're in a brick and mortar retailer, where the product you're seeking to buy was made. But online retailers don't have the same obligations until we update the law. And this pandemic has definitely shown our purchasing change from brick and mortar stores as we're ordered or guided to remain at home. And you can't access that information online very easily in most cases. This would require basically an update of our labeling laws so that you can be as sharp a shopper online as you are when you are in a store. And I think this is so essential right now, especially as we see so much of our shopping done now online.
I completely agree. And just an editorial comment here, I would say, I was at a Federal Trade Commission panel on consumer labeling, and it is striking how there is no obligation whatsoever for online retailers to include this type of information. It makes it exceptionally challenging for consumers to find out lots of different type of information information, but especially the country of origin material. And so very grateful for your leadership on that, Senator Baldwin.
Thank you.
So I wanted to shift for a second to the role that China and the government in Beijing plays, in particular, with respect to American manufacturing. And again, this is an issue where you've been at the forefront. You were the co-author of legislation that was included in last year's defense bill that would limit the participation of state-owned enterprises, especially those coming from countries like China, from getting tax dollars in our transit markets. This has been a challenge for American manufacturers. And so we're grateful for that. So how do you see the implementation of this law unfolding? And I imagine there have to be other circumstances in which American manufacturers and workers have been disadvantaged by these types of unfair trade practices as well. What does that look like from your perspective?
Yeah, so we've known for a long, long time that in a non-market economy like China's, that there is state subsidy that is supporting any number of enterprises. Some of them are wholly state-owned, but others get freebies like free land or free utility, without bills. They have all sorts of subsidies and help from the state. And I know in a manufacturing state like Wisconsin, our workers can compete against anyone as long as we have a level playing field. But when you have that level of subsidy or assist from China, it's not a level playing field. Now, China knows that we watch these things carefully, and they've tried to get even more, they've tried to work around the rules in different ways. So one of the things they're doing, especially in the area of transit, is that they are making all the major components in China and then opening a shop somewhere in the United States for assembly. And that enterprise is both subsidized by the fact that the parts are made in state-owned enterprises or subsidized enterprises, and that they are appearing to be a US company when they're really not. And it also has that same unlevel playing field for US entrance into that market. So we can't let them, look for the loopholes. We've got to be savvy about the fact that they're going to try incredibly hard to keep that on level playing field, and our taxpayer dollars shouldn't be helping them do that.
Absolutely. And we're, again, grateful for your leadership on that. It was I think it was telling that there was bipartisan support for this measure, and the overwhelming support, in fact, I think in the Senate for it. We're grateful for that. One last question, because I know we're obviously in very, very tough times here, and you represent a state that is perhaps the leading state in manufacturing across the nation. It's certainly the most manufacturing intensive, has a long and proud history. So I don't need to tell you any of that. I know that you're well aware, but so our audience knows what's at stake far above the national average in terms of the number of folks who are working in manufacturing and the percentage of the economy. So we've seen a lot of manufacturing job loss. 1.3 million manufacturing jobs vanished in April alone. Lowest recording of industrial production in over a century. The House has passed legislation that's clearly still in relief mode, and rightfully so, because we have not opened back up yet. But I'm wondering, once that action shifts back over to the Senate, what some of your hopes are not only for steps that are necessary to reopen America, obviously the public health response and testing and what have you, but what does manufacturing need, or what will manufacturing need, in your estimation, to begin this what is bound to be a long recovery?
Absolutely. So I think one of the priorities is Buy America policies embedded in our manufacturing strategies, et cetera. You know, one of the things, just to tell a story about how I came to be such a booster of Buy America policies, it was actually in the public health realm. Many years ago, I was sitting on a panel during a particularly harsh outbreak of influenza. There was a problem in one of the vaccine manufacturing plants overseas, and it caused a shortage of influenza vaccine. And I remember asking, well, can't we ramp up production here in the US? And they said, well, there are no manufacturers of the vaccine in the US. And I said, wait, that can't be true, can it? And indeed it was. And so that was one of the first things, is how are we going to be safe, secure, and healthy in a pandemic, for example, if we don't manufacture these life-saving or preventative things here in the United States? But it made me think about how many other things are manufactured outside of the health realm. Our infrastructure, our national security, all are dependent upon us having the capability and a foothold in producing those things here in America. So I think about a victory just last week when the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee added my permanent Buy America language to their Water Infrastructure and Drinking Water Act that just passed out of committee. Why is that important? Well, state like Wisconsin that has manufacturers like Neenah Foundry, if you think about it, look down, you'll see the manhole covers that say Made in Neenah or Neenah Foundry. Those companies can also be undercut by China's cheating practices, subsidized businesses from China or other places. We need a level playing field, and we have to be able to meet our own infrastructure needs in this country. So Buy America, I think, is going to be a really important policy moving forward and helping get our manufacturing back up and running.
Absolutely. And just one last question, Senator, before we let you go. And thank you so much for your time again today to talk about these important topics. You know, some have looked at this for the reasons that you cited, economic and national security, to reshore work from China and other countries. And you mentioned medicines and others. Mm-hmm. Clearly, there's a big example in Wisconsin of this, you know, of Foxconn and the type of incentives that were thrown at them, and a lot of controversy about it. I don't need to tell you that. But as you're looking ahead, what do you think are the right incentives to try to bring some of this production back to the United States and to recreate these manufacturing ecosystems that built the middle class, made us the world leader in innovation, and the world leader in manufacturing?
Yeah, so I think that Buy America policies do send that signal. So, for example, I'm not telling the private sector what to do, but I'm saying that if we're going to use our taxpayer dollars for infrastructure, for medical equipment, for things that we will be purchasing, if we make clear that we expect the components as well as the final product to be manufactured domestically, that sends a clear signal about future work orders and future purchase orders that you don't get without such policies. And we can sometimes lose some of this manufacturing base to overseas if a state subsidized business can undercut our price until we're out of business. That is no way to proceed. And so I think we can do that not only in infrastructure and as we're talking about the Defense Production Act for all the things that we have needed to fight this pandemic and may need in the future, but also in other realms. And I think about defense contractors. We build ships, by the way, in the state of Wisconsin, and making sure that we can build ships for the Navy without having to be dependent upon a component from across the globe that's key to its success and its mission.
Thank you very much, Senator. And I look forward to the time where we can make it back to your great state and have some of the brats and beer and cheese curds and tour some of the great factories that that I know make you proud. And thank you again for working so diligently on behalf of businesses and workers in Wisconsin.
Thank you so much.
What the pay in this job does for me, it means the most. It means my livelihood for myself, for my family, for the neighborhood, and also for the state of Ohio. It's not just me.
Senator Brown, welcome to the interview.
Good to be with you, Scott. Again, thank you.
Yeah, likewise. It seems like some days it seems like a day ago, sometimes it seems a year ago, and I was testifying at the Senate Banking Committee in March. It seems like another world.
That's right. It was right before all this was happening.
That's right. So I wanted to ask you, because speaking of the Banking Committee, it has jurisdiction over the Defense Production Act. Probably not a lot of people who were watching today or even in Washington had even thought about the Defense Production Act prior to this current crisis. But this crisis has shown some of the tools that are available. I'm wondering, from your perspective and being the ranking member on this committee, how has the Trump administration used the DPA wisely, or what pivots need to be made?
Well, he's not used it wisely. The Defense Production Act is one of the things. I mean, when you look at this pandemic, what it really has done is it's been the great revealer. It has showed the strengths and weaknesses of our society. It's shown the strengths of our society and how we work together and look out for our neighbors and all of that. It's shown the weakness of our society in terms of the racial disparities. Look who's dying. Look who the essential workers are. People that have to go to work and are making barely adequate wages, middle class, lower middle class, working class, low wages, and are expected to go to work and every day expose themselves potentially as virus, then come home and have the anxiety of perhaps spreading it to their families. But one of the things we've learned is the Defense Production Act could actually be used in the right way. It was Harry Truman signed the bill 70 years ago. It was essentially to keep the United States prepared if we had to scale up for a war, and making sure we're making the tanks and the airplanes and the things we need. President Trump could have used the Defense Production Act in the same way to make sure we had masks, we had testing supplies, that we could then do contact tracing, that we had the other kinds of protective equipment, gloves and gowns and all that. He didn't use it for that. He kept talking about using it. He never did. He's not been willing to lead the charge to get the protective equipment we need, to get the testing equipment. That's why we're 5% of the world's population and have had almost 1/3 of the deaths, because the president hasn't led. But the Defense Production Act could make sure this doesn't happen again, and that is applying the Defense Production Act to all things public health. Public health is just as big a crisis as a foreign threat. In some sense, it is a foreign threat. It also will help us as a nation do what we've done so well. We led the world in the eradication of polio. We led the world in the eradication of smallpox. We led the world in getting rid of diphtheria. All the kinds of, the U.S. is summoned all over the world to help people, to keep health crises in some countries from spreading to the whole world. It's one of our greatest achievements, and the president has just pulled back. Finally, the time he uses the Defense Production Act, it's supposed to be used for workers and for national defense. He used it to make a bunch of workers go back to work in an unsafe place, a meatpacking plant, where he didn't even say slow down the line and get protective equipment. He just said, go back to work. No thought of worker safety, no thought of food safety. It's clearly a mockery of the Defense Production Act to use it that way instead of for our national defense, instead of for our public health.
So, Senator, I think that's a good point. And something that gets overlooked in this is the role that the United States has traditionally played in leading global recovery efforts. And if we have to bootstrap to supply the types of equipment that our first responders and our healthcare system needs right now, I know I was just talking to the folks at Magnet that are involved in a statewide effort in Ohio to try to scale up production. We're usually the ones who are helping the developing world in this. That's certainly not the case right now. So I think that's one important reason why we should have this scale up capacity. Speaking of manufacturing in Ohio, you know this better than anyone. Manufacturing usually sees a shock from downturns and is usually slower to recover. And obviously, we've seen an extraordinary economic shock from this pandemic and the response to it. 1.3 million manufacturing jobs lost in April, a century, a record that's been held for more than a century about a drop in industrial production also happened last month. From your perspective, what is it going to take to get manufacturing back on its feet after all of this? Is the market going to take care of it, or are we going to need some public investment and some other tools available?
Well, one thing we've learned from this pandemic, if many people already knew this or believed this, many didn't, and that is the role of the government, the role of the public sector. The private sector is not going to solve these problems. The private sector is not going to keep people from being evicted. The private sector is not going to keep local governments from laying off police and fire and sanitation. The private sector is not going to keep our schools funded when their revenues drop. Is not going to protect people in the workplace. It's clear it's the role of government. So that's the first lesson from all this is when we move forward, we have to have that role of government. In terms of manufacturing, unfortunately, the president came to this about 3 months late when my governor in Ohio, and this isn't a partisan statement, Mike DeWine's a Republican, I'm a Democrat, he stepped up, he saved lives. He saved Ohioans from dying because he stepped up early. The president was still calling it a hoax and a Democratic effort to impeach him. And as certainly as Governor DeWine has saved lives in Ohio, the president's cost us lives all over the country. 5% of the world's population, almost a third of the world's deaths because of that inaction. And that's why we got hit so hard, both by the virus and the economic hit. South Korea's unemployment rate, they got their first case was the same day as the US first case. Their unemployment rate's 3.2%. Why? Because they dealt with it early. They did extensive testing. They, I believe, as many countries around the world, because public health says do this, did contact tracing. So they were able to limit the economic damage. So the only way to get people back to work the way that we should and the numbers that should, and especially in manufacturing, is that people know it's safe to go to the workplace. You don't order people back into a meatpacking plant, order workers back without guaranteeing their safety. You don't send them back to work without an enhanced OSHA to make sure that workers are protected. Then workers will be eager to come back. They'll want to produce. They'll want to go back to their important jobs, their essential jobs, I might add. Although a worker said to me, if we're essential, why do they pay us so little and why do they not protect us? It makes us look expendable. But if we do this right, with government's role, with the private sector, manufacturers will go back to work. The last part of that is a lot of this work could have come from a scaled up Defense Production Act if the president had used it to make cotton swabs. There's a company in Cleveland that makes that makes Q-tips. They finally have transitioned. It took 3 months because of the White House's boneheadedness. I've been talking to the White House for weeks and weeks and weeks, as is the owner of that company. Finally, we've switched over there. That should have been done in January. Those people would have gone back to work more. They would have hired even more people at their plant, and nurses and bus drivers and others would have been safer because they would have had the protective equipment they need.
Yeah. So I certainly take your point on the need to have an adequate public health response to this relief testing. Beyond that, Senator Brown, and knowing how difficult it was for manufacture to recover during the Great Recession, and I'm also thinking about the economic footprint that you have in Ohio with the auto sector and what have you. Do you think that the Senate, Congress needs to look at incentives with respect to automobiles or infrastructure investment or other sorts of boosts in public spending?
I think that America has learned that there is a role for government and that there is a role for a better trade policy and a tax policy. We have seen now for a full generation, starting really before NAFTA, but accelerated by NAFTA, where many American companies have adopted as their business plan, shut down production in Cleveland or Mansfield or Toledo, move it overseas, get a tax break, enjoy cheaper wages and lower work safety and environmental standards, and sell products back in the United States. That's why we didn't have the protective equipment we need. That's why we didn't have cotton swabs, because essentially U.S. companies lobbied Congress to weaken those rules so they could move, to give them tax breaks and undermine trade policy so they could move overseas and make more money. That's what's going to happen next year, I assume, with a new president next year, where we will begin to look at trade policy, tax policy, align it with our national interest, our national defense interest, our national public health interest, and our national create good paying, often union jobs in this country, making things again.
Yeah, so let's hone in on the trade aspect here for a second, because as you know, the president said he achieved this phase 1 deal with China in January at the very beginning of this crisis. And from your perspective, is that enough to provide a level playing field that our workers and businesses are going to need, or what additional steps are you going to need to see from an administration, from a Congress moving forward?
Well, it's still too enticing for too many companies to shut down production here, get a tax break, the tax from the big Trump tax cut that 80% of it went to the richest and the largest corporations, and that blew up our budget deficit back 3 years ago. That's still, the tax rate is actually lower if you move production overseas. So until we change that, the new trade rules can help, but won't help enough. The Brown-Wyden provisions in the North American Free Trade Agreement made that agreement become essentially the first trade agreement I've ever voted for, because it was called the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. It lifted up worker standards so that American workers can compete with Mexican workers. We've always been productive, but it's just wages were so low, and it was so easy to bust unions in Mexico and so easy to evade environmental and worker safety laws. So finally, we have a government on trade and tax policy, I hope, come January, that's on the side of workers. Always look at this through the eyes of workers. If you do that, you're going to pass better trade policy, you're going to pass better tax policy. The way it is now, Mitch McConnell always looks at corporate interests. He wants to bail out the airlines and Wall Street, but he cares so little about workers, whether they're public employees in Hamilton County, Ohio, or whether they're grocery store workers in Kansas. He simply always picks corporate interests over worker interests, and that's why we have an economy where profits are up and executive compensation's up for years now, and wages have been flat.
Yeah. So for years, you have been, I think, both a pioneer and a lonely voice in national Democratic politics and talking about these issues. You've certainly brought them more into the mainstream. I've been intrigued because, and pardon me for the comparison, but lately you've seen Republicans like Marco Rubio, Josh Hawley write op-eds that you could have written 20 years ago. And granted, there's a lot of other policy differences that you have. But do you see an emerging consensus about the value of manufacturing or policies to back it up?
No, I think there's increasing interest in manufacturing. People saw how hollowed out too much of our manufacturing sector has become and what that means for manufactured prescription drugs. So many of the ingredients are still made in China, well over half the ingredients, maybe it's as high as 3/4 of ingredients. That's a real problem if there are international incidents between us and China. So I think that I'd like to say Republicans are coming around, and they are, but when it comes time to choose between corporate interests and worker interests, their political party so often pushes them in the interest of worker interests, in the interest of corporate interests, not to mention their appeals to race and their discussions of immigration and workers. So we still have a long way to go. I'm encouraged by some of my colleagues that are a little more conservative on these things, but and I'm encouraged that we were able to get the Brown-Wyden language into the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, which turned just another corporate trade agreement into a pro-worker trade agreement. To me, it's all about that. But you've got to, the Republicans have to break their addiction to corporate tax giveaways, because if you continue to give the store away to corporate interests, you continue to give them a lower tax rate to work in India than to produce in India than to produce in Indiana. You really cannot fix this hollowing out of American manufacturing in too many different industries.
Right. So the arguments, like, for instance, Larry Kudlow will say, well, perhaps we should reduce the corporate tax rate further. Or Kevin McCarthy will say, well, the way to bring manufacturing back is that we need more deregulation for these corporations. I think your argument is that the financialization of the economy, the incentives to do the wrong thing, and also the lack of trade enforcement have been some of the key issues here. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, their argument has been tried in the Reagan years, and now weaken environmental laws, weaken worker safety laws, weaken auto safety or consumer safety laws. And they've tried that. They've tried to lower their taxes, keep cutting the corporate tax rate. Those things don't work. They work if you're a corporation. You make more money. Your executive compensation is greater. You can do more stock backs. You can do more dividend distribution. But you don't help wages. You don't help the environment. You don't help the workplace. So let's not go down the road of just because there's another crisis and they try to take advantage of this crisis by repackaging their let's deregulate and let's cut taxes. It's until we pass legislation that's pro-worker, until we look at in terms of taxes and in terms of trade, until we look at it through the eyes of worker interests, we'll continue to make the same mistakes. We'll continue to weaken the middle class. We'll continue to be a country where we have these huge wage and wealth disparities. And this pandemic has shown how damaging to the fabric of society those kinds of chasms are. Everything from the digital divide in our public schools to what's happened with housing, where 25% of renters in this country before the pandemic, 25% of renters spent more than half their income on rent, which means one thing happens in their lives and they lose their apartments. They're on the street, and that's not the mark of a society that we should want to live in.
Yeah. And Senator Brown, one last question for you. The Recovery Act from the Great Recession had Buy America requirements. It was something you insisted on at the time. Obviously, there were loopholes, there were some waivers. Whatever assistance is coming through the Senate, do you think there ought to be Buy America requirements as you look ahead to the debate that's going to take place in the Senate on an economic recovery package as well?
Yeah, I credit one of my best friends in the Senate, Tammy Baldwin from Wisconsin, for really leading the charge in Buy America. And you can't do any of this without strong, vibrant, enforceable Buy America provisions. So you want to take the Defense Production Act, you want to extend it from national defense to call it healthcare defense, call it pandemic defense against pandemics, just call it a public health, apply it to public health, and you have Buy America provisions with it. It strengthens it. It means in another time of public health crisis, whatever it might be, coming out of climate change, coming out of a virus or a bacteria or a parasitic infection, that we will be much more ready to scale up to protect ourselves. And again, that doesn't just help save lives. It keeps people at work more, because if the president had done any of these things in January, our economy might look more like South Korea's 3.2% unemployment rate instead of like ours, which is, I don't know how high, 15%, and probably continuing to go up percent unemployment.
Absolutely. One issue, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention this. First of all, very grateful for all of your support for manufacturing and for steelworkers over the decades as well. You've been consistently on their side. What do you think? We saw steel mills obviously lay people off as we were heading into this crisis because there was a drop in demand. What do you think it's going to take to get an industry like steel back on its feet again?
Well, I think it's going to take the same efforts for steel as it does autos, as it does manufacturing generally, and that is a focus of the partnership between government and manufacturing, the private sector. It's going to take Buy America provisions. It's going to take a comparable in public health to Defense Production Act. It's going to take scaling up of magnet, as you mentioned earlier, the partnership between government and helping train workers in manufacturing. All those things need to be part of manufacturing policy.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Sherrod Brown, Senator from Ohio, thank you so much for sharing your views with us. And thank you, more importantly, for your work on behalf of Ohio's workers and manufacturers.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks for what you do for the Alliance for American Manufacturing. So appreciative. Thanks.
And when we come back, I'll be sitting down with Roxanne Brown of the United Steelworkers, Kim Glas of the National Council of Textile Organizations, to talk about what it will take to get manufacturing back to work, right after this brief video message.
My steel job means
Keeping my family going.
My life, my future, my family's future.
opportunity to see that they have a better future maybe than what I've experienced.
Retirement and health benefits for my family and longevity for the next generation.
My steel job means my livelihood.
Employees there at U.S. Steel that I represent.
My steel job means a better tomorrow for my family.
The economy in our neighborhood and everything that goes with it.
Okay, thank you for staying with us. And I want to welcome into this panel Roxanne Brown. She is a vice president at the United Steelworkers Union, which is North America's largest industrial union, as well as Kim Glas. Kim is the CEO of the National Council of Textile Organizations. These are companies that produce textiles, fabric, and apparel here in the United States of America. Both of these colleagues are deeply embedded in manufacturing and what it will take to spur a recovery. And we're going to get to some questions that all of you posed to us over the last couple of hours as well. I want to first turn to Roxanne and ask her kind of what has the pandemic's impact been on your membership? Particularly the membership that you have in manufacturing, Roxanne.
Hi, Scott. And I wanted to just, before I answer that question, just thank you and thank AAM for really putting together this important event. Also thank Senators Rubio, Hawley, Brown, and Baldwin for their leadership in this space. It's clear as a result of this crisis that we really need thoughtful and strong industrial policy. And I think a lot of the pieces that have been discussed in this conference need to be incorporated in that policy. And it's clear that it needs to be done in a bipartisan way. The COVID crisis, I think, for our union, really exposed what we have intimately known and seen for the last 40 plus years with the offshoring of jobs and the loss of industrial capacity. Unfortunately, now this crisis highlighted the loss of key sectors of our manufacturing economy that lend to saving Americans' lives. And I think now we're at a point where we really have to step away from the rhetoric that has surrounded the manufacturing sector in this country for so long, that has really frustrated our members for a very long time, and really turned that rhetoric into action. But to specifically answer your question, our members and the products they make, they literally touch every segment of this economy. And I just scrolling across, I see a lot of our members are on this Zoom call, but their products literally touch every segment of the economy, from steel to tires to paper to oil to pharmaceuticals. And quite literally, because the economy has been so impacted, they've been impacted. And you know, what we're seeing across the landscape is that there are some facilities, you know, that may rebound and others that may not. So it's a very frustrating and dire time for a lot of manufacturing across the country.
Thank you for that, Roxanne. Kim, I wanted to ask you the same question. Since the pandemic hit, and we've had obviously the public health emergency, the economic consequences, what has it been like for the folks who make textiles, fabric, and garments in America?
To build off what Roxanne Brown from the United Steelworkers, and by the way, is a tremendous leader within that union, as well as you, Scott, and your strong commitment to American manufacturing. This period of time, it's hard to even quantify. We are in about 8 weeks of this crisis. I've got idle capacity within the textile industry, even as the headlines are talking about some of the industry's profound efforts to making personal protective equipment. We have seen 90% of our orders at some of our facilities be canceled, and no real understanding of when the economy and consumer spending will come back online. Just to further articulate this, we are the largest consumer of US cotton, and our cotton consumption is down 92% from last year. This has had a profound impact on our manufacturing sector, as well as other manufacturing sectors across the economy. And like any manufacturing industry, we're the first to feel slippage in the American economy. And it's going to be a slow start to recover, even as the economy comes back online. So we need a robust manufacturing stimulus to help workers get back on the job. We need to provide certainty in the marketplace, and we need strong public policies to help industries like ours recover. And for the PPE that's now being made here in the United States by United Steelworkers, textile workers across this country, we need to ensure that we build those supply chains moving forward.
Yeah, and Kim, I'm glad you raised that, because I wanted to turn to that next. And we received several audience questions, and I'm from Dejanay Shaw, United Steelworker Local 7600, Janine Twig of Michigan, Robbie McKee of Ohio, Gary Harvey of Steelworker Local 676, and others. What has this crisis told us about the need to reshore these critical supply chains and jobs? And Kim, I'll ask you first, and then I'll ask Roxanne to weigh in on that as well.
Well, as soon as the coronavirus really hit the national headlines, and you're watching nurses and doctors and hospital systems and governors seeking personal protective equipment, and recognizing our foreign supply chains, which have long been dominated by China in their subsidized industry, break down literally overnight. We immediately got calls from all of these systems and these government officials asking about what our industry could do. And parts of this supply chain have been long offshored, seeking the lowest price. But at what price is it to the people on the front lines in our hospitals and our workers and our communities? What price are we willing to pay? So our industry quickly pivoted. This is not like turning on pushing a button. You really need to work very quickly in this kind of environment to create new supply chains, from creating face masks to gowns to even testing kit swabs, that our industry was able to pivot and respond. But these supply chains, without careful thought and strategy moving forward, will just evaporate. We need to think about the public policy needs long term to ensure that these supply chains remain onshore.
Thank you, Kim. And Roxanne, I'd like you to expand on that, because I know the steelworkers obviously represent manufacturing workers. They represent a surprising number of healthcare workers as well. And so you've seen both sides of this. I mean, from your perspective, what has this crisis told us about the need to reshore critical medical supplies and other items that are of national health, economic security interest, Roxanne?
Scott, you're right. Our union, obviously, we're at our core manufacturing union, but we also represent about 50,000 members in the healthcare sector. And, you know, I would say that our nation's response to this crisis was essentially like sending a soldier into war with no weapons. So our 50,000 healthcare workers that have been standing on the front lines during this crisis had to step into this crisis to fight it with no weapons. And those weapons were gloves and face masks and shields and gowns, testing kits, you know, ventilators for hospitals. These are all of the things that we were so woefully unprepared to provide for them, but also for the American public. And, you know, I think we're in a situation also where we're seeing opportunists take advantage of the moment. There are rampant stories of price gouging, and Kim could I'm sure share many of these stories, where you have instances where some of these supplies have gone up by as much as 1,000%. In some cases, N95s that were 38 cents before the crisis are now $6. You know, so there's a lot that's happening in this crisis that's really exposing not just the woeful inadequacy of our supplies, but also just the nefarious forces in this country who are taking advantage of this crisis. And, you know, I've watched Kim Glas, who's actually one of my best friends, you know, try to weave together, no pun intended, a supply chain in the textiles industry, because there have been so many holes left by bad trade policies over the years. And thankfully, we have companies like American Roots in Maine that have basically shifted their production to make masks and shields, but we need a lot more, and we really need to rebuild our capacity. We've ceded for too long jobs, technology, innovation, and industrial capacity to other nations, and that has to stop.
Yeah, thank you, Kim. And I think you're right. We've kind of shifted from the arsenal of democracy to the arsenal of health, but a lot of this has been bootstrapping and pivoting and not part of a strategy. I'm going to stick with you, Roxanne. Another bucket of questions from the audience. So we got dozens that were related to this, and that's about the role of China. Mm-hmm. And, you know, all four senators obviously think that obviously U.S. policy plays a role in all of this, but so do the actions of the Chinese government and its policies as well. And particularly Howard Fraunberger, Maggie Miller, and a bunch of others asked questions like this. So what is the role that the Chinese government has played in all of this? And also then, what is the way out of it? I mean, what's the right policy response that you see?
Honestly, and I think I'll take this question from a few different ways. China, the Chinese government has been a problem for a very long time for domestic industries across the board, not just in the medical supply space. Our union, for the last several years, has been dealing with massive overcapacity from China across a series of product lines, from steel to paper to chemicals and others. And the same in this space, where China really had the market on a lot of these medical supplies that were needed, and they kept it, for a long time as they were dealing with it and didn't, send it out to the marketplace. And so you had, people here who really needed those products really scrambling to actually get them. But overall, I would say that the practices of China that have really been unfair and nefarious for quite some time have led to a situation where we've had so much loss across a lot of our domestic industries. The overcapacity, as I've mentioned, the transshipment, as was mentioned by one of the senators earlier, the subsidizing of their industries, as was mentioned by Senator Baldwin, where you have industries in China who get their energy costs paid for, or they get a free building to basically operate their production. All of these things has unleveled the playing field for domestic industries across the board when it comes to China and the products that they produce. And to address that problem won't be one single bullet. You heard, I wrote down as the senators were speaking, at least 6 suggested policy measures. That's just a drop in the bucket of really what is necessary to revitalize domestic manufacturing and to get at the problem of China. It's making sure that we are advancing Buy America policies, as has been said many, many, many times on this call. It's making sure that we are making investments in infrastructure. It's making sure that we're strengthening our trade laws. There's so much that needs to be built into strong industrial policy to really turn our economy around in a way that needs to be done, that hasn't been done yet.
Roxanne, thank you for that. Back to Kim for a question, because one of the policy responses for business relief has been with respect to tariffs. There are a variety of tariffs that have been imposed on imported products. Some have been there for a long time under what's called the most favored nation system. Mm-hmm. Some of them are there because of anti-dumping and countervailing duty orders, or the Section 301 tariff action on China, or the Section 232. Sorry for all these acronyms and numbers this late in the conversation, but there's just a lot of different programs that have tariffs out there. The retail community, the importers, really pushed for relief from these tariffs and to have a deferral of tariff payments. And unfortunately, they got their way. It was something that a lot of members of Congress advocated for. I don't think any of the four senators we had on today did, but the Trump administration approved this in April. And so what kind of impact does this have on domestic industry, or what message does this send, Kim?
The importing and retailing community have been strongly advocating with leaders on Capitol Hill and within the administration about tariff deferrals and waivers, and they need liquidity. These are the very same retailers who have offshored our industry. I can drive down to some of the counties of North Carolina and see shuttered mills. And I often wonder why the solution to their liquidity problems has to run through our manufacturing sector. The conversation needs to be about how do we invest in the companies and the workers in the United States of America, not what is the relief package to give to the importing and retailing community that have offshored these industries, and now we're paying a price, including on personal protective equipment. So moving forward, we as an industry, we need tariffs. We are a price-sensitive industry. There's a reason that tariffs are in place, because when we are negotiating with our free trade agreement partners, we need to raise the standards for wages and for environmental issues. And so tariffs are part of that negotiating package for market access in order to help level the playing field. And we can agree or disagree on how free trade agreements have been structured in the past and have that they provided equal opportunity for US workers. But that being said, it is critically important that we turn this conversation to what do we do to ensure US manufacturers recover. And there's many, many policies, including a strong Buy American policy for our industry, which would include expanding the Berry Amendment requirements for all personal protective equipment made of textile to be fiber, yarn, fabric, and cut and sewn here in the United States of America. We need to be rewarding this industry and our workers and putting people back on the job.
I completely agree. And it sounds like, Kim, with what you have said there, that, and what Roxanne said, and I agree, there's like 6 or 7 things that the senators pointed out, but there is a framework for a policy there that's more than tactics, that's a strategy, as Senator Rubio suggested, but includes procurement policy, a look at the impact that tax policy has on offshoring, something with respect to currency, clearly cracking down on the unfair trade practices, and being much more aggressive about that. It seems like there's a suite of policies that could be helpful. And so I want to pose a final question to both of you, and I'm going to start with Kim, and then I'll give Roxanne the last word here. You both represent workers and businesses that have been making things in this country for literally for generations. And I think it's very fair to say that there isn't a single one of those jobs that's not at risk now. And it's at risk for a variety of reasons. One is obviously we're in an unprecedented economic downturn. The other is that we still do have this massive manufacturing trade imbalance, and our policy response still hasn't got it right. And so, we're approaching election season, and we are nonpartisan, but there's going to be lots of politicians from both parties who are going to want to go out and put on that hard hat and wrap themselves in the flag and say, I'm for American manufacturing. So what does that have to mean? Kim, what does that have to mean for you and your members? And then I will turn to Roxanne.
We heard from various congressional leaders today from both sides of the aisle who are committed in a way that is across party lines on how to rebuild our industrial base. And we may all have different solutions to doing that, but we need to evaluate our work here in Washington, D.C. in terms of the progress that we're making in real people's lives. When people come to our facilities, we're thrilled. It's an opportunity for us to showcase our workers, the products, the level of investment happening here in the United States, and the innovation in the industry. And we hope, and oftentimes after they visit our companies, they come back to Washington better informed on how to make policy and try to advance that policy moving forward. But we can't have Washington gridlock. This is a different moment in time. We need to come together to figure out how do we get our economy back on track. And that is the litmus test for our industry. We're going to be looking at what Congress and the administration look to advance to help our industry recover. And then this is such a critical time.
Kim, thank you for that. Roxanne?
And I would just say that we're going to be looking to make sure that we don't go back to business as usual, and that business as usual is not the standard for which, whoever wants to achieve. As I think you said, Scott, before this crisis, manufacturing was in a really dire place in this country, and this crisis has only served to exacerbate it. So where we were before is not acceptable to our union. It's not acceptable to our members. We want more, and we're going to demand more. We are demanding more. And, a big part of that certainly rests with strengthening our trade laws. As we mentioned, our union unfortunately has a very long history of joining and bringing cases at the International Trade Commission, because there's this hodgepodge of getting at, unfair trade that's not cohesive. So we need to have a really strong kind of long-term way of getting at our trade policy that is more sustainable for our industries. It's making sure, as I mentioned, that we are ramping up and strengthening domestic procurement by America policies. And it's really making sure that we are investing in infrastructure. Right now there are about 39 million jobless claims that have been filed in the country. So there are a lot of manufacturing workers who are out of work right now. And we know that we need trillions of dollars in investment in our infrastructure. This week, we saw a huge failure in Midland, Michigan with the dams that failed, one which was 100 years old. And Dow Chemical is in Midland, Michigan. 700 steelworker members are in Midland, Michigan. 10,000 residents of that town were impacted because the infrastructure failed. We're at a time where we're all working from home, or kids are doing school from home. We have almost 160 million people in this country who don't have access to broadband. We have 2 million people in this country who don't have access to clean water at a time when everyone is saying, wash your hands, right? So, you know, there's so much that can be done in the way of upgrading and repairing our infrastructure that can be built into a broad industrial policy. And these are the types of things that we're not hoping to see. It's the types of things that we are expecting to see as we move forward. And so, you know, we stand ready to fight and to get this done.
Thank you for that, Roxanne and Kim. And we're going to come back next month and talk about infrastructure and rebuilding America and finding a path forward on that. And before we go, I want to thank our audience. We had dozens upon dozens of great questions, and we had what I would call a mostly civil conversation on the chat. So thank you for that. That's rare today. I also want to thank Josh Rogin, who co-hosted this event with me, for taking some time out of his busy schedule, as well as our other panelists, and obviously Senator Rubio, Senator Hawley, Senator Brown, and Senator Baldwin. I especially want to thank AAM stakeholders for the faith and commitment they have placed in our work, and others in the AAM family who helped to make this event possible behind the scenes. There's a lot of work that went into making this successful. So please, I want you to just take a minute to view this important message that we have for you before signing off. And I want you to know that you can continue to follow our work online at americanmanufacturing.org, on Twitter at KeepItMadeInUSA. We're on Instagram and Facebook as well. This conference will reside on our YouTube page as well as on our Facebook page shortly. We'll look forward to coming back to you with other high impact events like this. And I want to thank the hundreds upon hundreds of people from across the country who have tuned in today to hear this message. I'm Scott Paul, and on behalf of the Alliance for American Manufacturing and our stakeholders, together, I'm telling you, we can keep it made in America. Thank you all.
How did we get to this place in this country that we have to buy all our supplies from China?
When the coronavirus struck, the U.S. was not ready.
Hospitals struggling with their limited supplies of masks and equipment.
Nurses are literally begging for protective equipment.
We haven't had enough of these testing kits. Unfortunately, the supply chain around the world has been broken.
It never should have been like this. History has shown that Americans are always willing to help in a crisis. When the shortages began, many U.S. manufacturers answered the call. They improvised, bootstrapped, retooled. Factory workers put their own health on the line to deliver supplies to America's hospitals. But it has been a huge challenge, and one America should have seen coming. Some corporations spent the past several decades sending jobs and production to countries like China, turning a blind eye to worker exploitation, lax pollution controls, and massive government subsidies. These companies made huge profits even as factory workers in America suffered. This was no accident. Leaders of both parties put into place policies that helped ship these jobs overseas. Americans were told this would be beneficial. Stuff would be cheaper. We were promised that we'd still be able to access everything we needed in a crisis. Then the crisis hit, and the U.S. couldn't get what it needed right away. Polls show that Americans now want to reverse these decades of bad policy and rebuild our supply chains. Here's how we do it. First, we must ramp up our own production of essential products and medical goods. Second, Buy America preferences ensure our tax dollars are spent on made-in-America goods, not sent overseas. Next, policymakers should insist that corporations receiving relief packages from Washington bring any offshore jobs back home. Importers should pay tariffs on time, and trade enforcement should increase. Moreover, we must continue to hold China and other countries accountable for trade violations. Finally, a major investment in America's infrastructure will create new jobs and rebuild supply chains while also fulfilling a critical need. The coronavirus has been devastating, made all the worse because the United States was ill-prepared. We might not be able to stop the next virus or crisis, but we can make sure we have the ability to make what we need to deal with it, saving lives and building a better future for us all.